Chet Atkins told Jimi Hendrix his playing was undisciplined and unprofessional. Jimi played one note, and Chet Atkins' hands started shaking. The year was 1965. The place was a rehearsal room on Music Row in Nashville, Tennessee. Chet Atkins was 41 years old and had been the most respected guitarist in country music for 15 years. He had recorded with Elvis Presley. He had built the Nashville sound from the ground up. He had won Grammy Awards and sold millions of records and had accumulated a reputation so large and so solidly constructed that most people in the music industry treated his opinions not as opinions, but as facts. When Chet Atkins said something about guitar playing, the room listened. When Chet Atkins said something about guitar playing, the room agreed. Jimi Hendrix was 22 years old and had no reputation at all. He was between gigs in Nashville because the circuit had brought him there, staying in a rooming house on the north side of the city and eating whatever the day's earnings allowed. He had been playing professionally for 4 years, backing other artists on the road, developing in the margins of other people's shows the sound he was trying to build in the hours that belonged to him. He was unknown. He was broke. And he was, by the specific standards of Nashville in 1965, everything that Music Row had decided was not welcome. The meeting happened because of a mutual acquaintance, a session guitarist named Harold Pierce who had worked with both men in different capacities and who had made the mistake of mentioning to Chet Atkins, in passing, that there was a young player in town who Pierce thought was doing something interesting. Chet Atkins, who was not a man who spent time on things he did not consider worth his time, had said, "Bring him by." Pierce brought him by on a Tuesday afternoon. The rehearsal room was small and well-equipped, the kind of space that serious Nashville musicians used for the work that happened before the recording sessions, the refining, the arranging, the private working through of material that would later be presented in the studio. Chet Atkins was there with two of his regular collaborators, a session bassist and a drummer who had worked together for years and who occupied the background of Nashville recordings the way furniture occupies a room, essential and unremarked upon. Jimi came in carrying his guitar in a case that had seen better decades. He was wearing the combination of mismatched clothes that characterized his appearance during this period, not slovenly, but assembled from whatever was available, with the particular creativity of someone who has learned to make do. He introduced himself quietly. Pierce made the introductions. Chet Atkins looked at him with the evaluating gaze of a man who had seen thousands of guitarists and had developed over the years a rapid and largely accurate initial impression of which ones were worth his attention. His initial impression of Jimi Hendrix was not favorable. He said so. Not to Jimi directly, not at first, but to Pierce in a tone that was not quite quiet enough to be private. He said, "He doesn't look like a serious musician." Pierce, who had made the introduction and felt the weight of that responsibility, said, "Just listen." Chet Atkins sat down in a chair at the side of the room in the posture of a man who was doing a favor by being present. Jimi took the guitar out of the case, plugged into the small amplifier in the corner of the room, and began to play. What he played was not a showcase piece. He did not open with something designed to impress, did not lead with technique or flash or any of the approaches that young musicians typically use when auditioning for someone whose approval matters. He played something that was clearly in progress, unfinished, exploratory, moving through several different directions without committing to any of them. The kind of playing that looks from the outside like a musician thinking out loud. Chet Atkins watched for approximately 90 seconds. Then he said, in the authoritative tone of a man who has been right about these things for a long time, "That's undisciplined. You're jumping between ideas without developing any of them. That's not playing. That's noodling." The room went quiet. The session bassist and the drummer exchanged a brief glance. Pierce looked at the floor. The word noodling in Nashville in 1965 carried a specific and devastating weight. It was the word used for the playing of people who had not learned how to think, who had not developed the fundamental discipline that serious musicianship required. To be called a noodler by Chet Atkins in a Nashville rehearsal room in 1965 was to be dismissed completely and permanently. Jimi did not respond immediately. He stood with the guitar in his hands and looked at Chet Atkins with an expression that Pierce, who was watching carefully, later described as not angry and not hurt, but measuring. The expression of someone who is deciding something. Then he played one note, not a chord, not a phrase, not a riff or a scale run or any of the multi-note demonstrations that guitarists use when they want to show what they can do. One single note on the low E string, played with the full weight of his right hand and bent upward with his left until the pitch had traveled somewhere that a single note on a guitar is not supposed to be able to travel to. He held the bend. He held it past the point where most players would release it, past the point where the string tension would normally pull the note back to something manageable. He held it at the place where the note stopped being a note and started being a sound that had temperature and texture and a quality of human voice in it that the instrument was not supposed to be capable of producing. The sound lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, something happened to Chet Atkins's hands. Pierce saw it first. He was standing at the side of the room where Chet Atkins was seated, and he had a clear view of the older man's hands resting on his knees. During the 4 seconds that Jimi held the note, Chet Atkins's hands moved. Not dramatically, not with any large motion that would have been visible from across the room. They moved in the specific involuntary way that a musician's hands move when they hear something that their fingers want to respond to, but their body has not been given permission to play. A slight tightening of the fingers. A shift in the position of the left hand, as if it was reaching for a guitar that was not there. A fine tremor across both palms that lasted for the duration of the note and stopped when Jimi released the bend. Chet Atkins did not speak immediately. This was, according to everyone who knew him, unusual. Chet Atkins was not a man who was often at a loss for words in a musical context. He had opinions and he expressed them quickly, with the efficiency of someone who had spent years being the most authoritative person in the room and had learned that authority in musical contexts was expressed through clarity and speed of judgment. He sat for several seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Do that again." Jimi looked at him. He played the note again, the same string, the same bend, the same destination, that place above the fret where the note became something else. He held it for the same duration and released it in the same way, and the room received it in the same silence. Chet Atkins's hands moved again, the same reaching, the same involuntary tremor, the same response of a body that was hearing something and trying, without being asked to participate. This time, when the note ended, Chet Atkins stood up. He walked across the room to where Jimi was standing. He looked at the guitar, the battered, well-traveled instrument that had been assembled and reassembled over years of road use, and then he looked at Jimi's left hand. He said, "How are you doing that?" Jimi showed him. Not as a lesson, not as a demonstration with explanation attached, but in the direct way that one musician shows another, by doing it slowly, step by step, making the mechanics visible. Chet Atkins watched with the focused attention of a student, which was a posture that everyone in the room recognized as extraordinary. Chet Atkins had not been a student in a musical context for 20 years. He tried it himself on Jimi's guitar, which Jimi handed over without ceremony. His first attempt produced something close to the right shape, but without the quality, the temperature and texture and voice that Jimi's version had. He tried again. Better, but still not it. He handed the guitar back and said, "That's not in the instrument. That's in you." The session lasted another 2 hours. The session bassist and the drummer, who had come prepared for a brief introduction and a polite dismissal, stayed for all of it. The conversation between Chet Atkins and Jimi moved through technique and then through theory, and then through something less categorizable, an exchange between two people who had arrived at the guitar from completely different directions and were discovering, in real time, that they had been building toward the same question from opposite ends. Pierce, who had made the introduction and had spent the first 20 minutes of it wishing he hadn't, said afterward that watching Chet Atkins and Jimi Hendrix talk about the guitar for 2 hours was like watching two people discover they spoke the same language, despite having no common vocabulary. He said they kept finding the same things from completely different angles. Chet would say something that came from 15 years of Nashville discipline, and Jimi would say something that came from 4 years of road playing, and they would stop and look at each other because they had just said the same thing in completely different words. Chet Atkins never spoke publicly about that afternoon in the rehearsal room. He was not a man who told stories about being surprised, and what had happened to his hands during those 4 seconds was the kind of thing that a man of his particular dignity and reputation preferred to keep private. But Pierce, who had been there, and the session bassist, who had also been there, both told the story in later years, told it the same way, with the same details, arriving at the same moment with the same specificity. The note, the hands, the 4 seconds. What happened in the room after Chet Atkins said, "Do that again," was something that the session bassist described in a later interview as the most unusual thing he had witnessed in 20 years of Nashville sessions. He had been in rooms with the best players in country music. He had watched Chet Atkins work with artists who were technical equals and artists who were not, and he knew the specific quality of attention that Chet brought to each situation. The attention he brought to Jimi Hendrix after those 4 seconds was not the attention he brought to technical equals. It was something rarer than that. It was the attention of a man who has encountered something genuinely outside his map. The bassist said, "I've seen Chet Atkins listen to thousands of guitarists. I've seen him impressed and I've seen him bored, and I've seen everything in between. What I saw after that note was none of those things. It was closer to what you see on a person's face when they've just been shown something that changes the size of the room they thought they were in. He didn't look smaller. He looked like the room got bigger." This is a distinction that matters. Chet Atkins was not diminished by what he heard. His hands moved because the music reached the place below analysis and judgment where the body simply responds, the place where music is supposed to reach. His hands moved because he was a musician, and Jimi was a musician, and the note Jimi played was the kind that makes musicians' hands move regardless of what their minds are doing. The discipline Chet Atkins had built over 15 years was not wrong. The note was the product of a different discipline, not less rigorous, but differently aimed. Aimed not at the clean execution of the written intention, but at the space between the written notes, where music stops being a craft and becomes something that goes directly to the body without asking permission. Chet Atkins understood this by the end of the 2 hours, and the hands were the evidence of that understanding arriving before the words did. The 2 hours that followed the note were not, as the session bassist described them, a tutorial or a demonstration in any formal sense. They were a conversation, the specific kind of conversation that happens between musicians when the usual hierarchy of the room has been suspended and both parties are operating as genuine equals. Chet Atkins asked questions that he would not have asked anyone else in Nashville, questions that revealed the limits of what his training had given him access to. Jimi answered them directly, without the deference that a 22-year-old unknown might have been expected to show a man of Chet Atkins' standing, because the note had established something between them that made deference irrelevant. The drummer, who had said nothing throughout the session, spoke once near the end. He said, "I've been playing sessions in this room for 8 years. I've never heard anybody make a guitar do that." Jimi thanked him. Chet Atkins said nothing, but the drummer noticed that he was writing something in the small notebook he always kept in his jacket pocket, the notebook where he recorded technical observations he wanted to return to later. He wrote for approximately 30 seconds. Then he put the notebook away and did not take it out again for the rest of the session. The session bassist, who had watched Chet Atkins' hands during those 4 seconds, said that whatever was in the notebook, the hands had already said it. He said, "Those hands knew something before the rest of him caught up. That's what the note did. It got to his hands before it got to his head. And that's the only review of a musician that has ever meant anything to me. Not the words, the hands." Jimi Hendrix left Nashville shortly after and eventually made his way to New York, where Chas Chandler found him and brought him to London. Chet Atkins remained in Nashville and continued building the legacy that would eventually make him one of the most decorated musicians in the history of country music. They never met again. But Pierce said that in the years after Jimi became famous, after the experience and the records and Monterey and Woodstock, he asked Chet Atkins once, carefully, what he thought about how things had turned out. Chet Atkins was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I called him undisciplined. He played one note and showed me what discipline actually looked like. Some lessons take 4 seconds. Some of them take a lifetime to understand." He said nothing more about it. But Pierce noticed, in the rehearsal sessions that followed in the months and years after that afternoon, that Chet Atkins had begun doing something with his bends that he had not done before. Something that reached slightly further than Nashville convention required. Something that had, in the right light at the right moment, a quality of temperature and texture that had no name in the vocabulary of country music. It had a name in another vocabulary entirely. But Chet Atkins was not going to say it out loud. He was simply going to play it.